I am going to ask Rick to rejoin me. Hey, Rick, that was a fascinating conversation. I think it was really interesting to hear his perspective on a lot of those issues that had come up earlier.
Yeah, I think it was fascinating, and it's interesting. You mentioned at the end the acting chief role, especially in a time like this that's so turbulent and so active. And I think he's doing a great job.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I see we're joined by two other fantastic minds and thought leaders in cyber who have really paved the way for progress and change and improvement. And I'm going to just butt right out of this conversation and let you take it from here. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks, Suzanne.
So
thank you.
I'm very pleased to have with us Chris Inglis, who is the Robert and Mary Looker Professor in Cybersecurity Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy. And he's also a managing director at Paladin Capital Group, and he is on the board of FedEx. And also with us is Ciaran Martin, who's the former CEO of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, a former GCHQ employee. He's also a managing director at Paladin. And are you on a board as well, Ciaran? Sorry.
I'm an advisor to Garrison in the UK and Paladin, and then my main job is at Oxford University.
Well, there you go. Great. So I'm really happy to have both you guys here. And as I mentioned, the topic today is SolarWinds, and I wanted to, which you may have heard of, and I wanted to start off by just asking you both for what's your take on the SolarWinds attack? Chris, let's go with you first.
So I had the benefit of listening to Kevin Mandia speak earlier. I think I'd have to say I'll draft on those remarks. We're clearly in a challenging place. That's a self-evident remark. But my view is that three things. There will be calls to strengthen the supply chain, to kind of then actually defend it. That's self-evident. That's obvious. But I also think that we need to reimagine what supply chains are. SolarWinds actually is one of the simplest supply chains that you can imagine in terms of from production to consumption, and yet it's still an adjacent series of stovepipes. There's very little sharing from one party to the next about the provenance of what's been provided, the context of that, or rather the current status of that, whether that's at risk, whether there's some anomaly that's been detected, and therefore can we, across the length of that supply chain, thinking horizontally, find anomalies that can't be found by one party alone, or put them in a context that no one party enjoys. If we do not reimagine those supply chains and act accordingly, we will continue to suffer the kind of the travesties that we're now experiencing with SolarWinds, no matter how strong we make the parts and how vigorously we defend any one of those patches, any one of those individual stovepipes. To that point, then I think we have to figure out how do we reimagine the relationships of the parties who profit, who benefit from these supply chains. They're not going away. So it's not that we can throw them off the raft because they're no longer useful to us. They're profoundly useful and necessary to us. And the context ought to be, how do we collectively defend them, as opposed to how do you defend your piece, I'll defend my piece, and hope that the seam between us does not move. I think if we do those three things, kind of make them resilient, robust, actually defend them, that's the first part. Second, reimagine them. And then third, act accordingly, change the relationships, we'll be in a better place. There's a whole raft of downstream recommendations about sharing information, breach notification, data sets, all of that. But I think they follow and flow from those top three things.
Okay, Ciaran?
The problem with sharing a panel with Chris is that, particularly when you go after him, is that the wisdom he imparts, there's precious little to add, and that's the situation in which I find myself here. But I think he's right to focus on essentially those systemic issues in our own environments. I mean, I know this is primarily targeted against the US, but that was the choice of the hackers. It could have just as easily been any of the US's allies, and it may turn out subsequently that major aspects of it were, even if there's no evidence of that. So just two things by way of embellishment of Chris's points rather than contestation or introduction of completely different points. I think SolarWinds, because of its almost old-fashioned complexity, forced us to think about a number of our assumptions in a different way. I mean, firstly, it didn't, it was a reminder that we haven't fixed a lot of long-standing problems, and whilst it's both fashionable and necessary to look at strategic technology coming down the line and the security challenges associated with that, it still shows that there are a large number of quite serious vulnerabilities with what we have and the way we live now, which need addressing. But it also, I think, made us think. I mean, I'm not sure I've changed greatly my worldview on this, but I've thought harder as a result of SolarWinds about some of the discussions around things like norms and around acceptable behavior. But where I've alighted on, I think, is a very similar place to Chris, which is about the sort of infrastructure and ecosystem and so on. And so if you take some of the things that the likes of Microsoft, I'm only singling them out because they've been more vocal than others, have said, I haven't particularly sort of changed my view on what is and isn't acceptable conduct and how we need to protect against that. But I do think we need to be thinking quite hard about incentives and about, I mean, if you take disclosing, if you like, the gist of some internal conversations that Chris and I would have at Paladin. If you're looking at an investment target with great ambitions and great potential for growth, there's something about almost thinking, let's say this company, this tiny little company, achieves its ambitions and becomes an absolute centerpiece of the modern digital economy. Is it capable of handling that responsibility? And how do we incentivize it to handle that responsibility? What are the regulatory, what are the commercial correctives that will say, right, this company from the outset is going to be capable, if it scales, it's going to be capable of not being a sort of landing point for hostile activity in the supply chain. And I think we've got a lot of hard thinking to do about how we incentivize that. And I think part of it as well is it's made me think quite hard about harm and how we talk about cybersecurity harm. And it's really quite difficult and subtle. When the Russians are reckless, and they have been reckless, it's easier to talk about it. This should not have happened. Political interference in elections should not happen. Careless attacks on Ukraine that wipe hundreds of millions of dollars off Danish shipping giants, it shouldn't happen. But how do you articulate harm? How do you do the rallying call for something like SolarWinds? How do you talk to our citizens about this and incentivize them and so forth? And again, it's a really, really hard problem because of the nature of the societies that we have. A slightly schmaltzy, but I think in part, I hope effective way of starting to talk about it is I think we need to start talking about cybersecurity not just as an operation, not just as an organizational and individual need, but actually as a public good. Environmental protection is a public good. So is digital environmental protection. And I'm just trying to think about ways in which we can try to get a movement together on that sort of narrative to try to incentivize all of us to clean up the place.
Okay. Ciaran, I'm going to give this one to you first, since so you get to go first and not follow Chris. You alluded to this in your response just a minute ago, but one of the things that's true is that as diversity in an environment goes down, fragility goes up. And so that's just true in software as it is true in the biological sphere. And so as companies strive to narrow the scope of applications that their people in their security operations centers have to look at as they strive to go from 100 tools to 60 tools to 50 tools to one tool, that everything's on a single pane of glass, so to speak, in their operations center, that increases the level of fragility because it gives a single point where someone, if they focus on that, now they've got access to everything. And as you know from your time at GCHQ, that's kind of one of the tenets of intelligence services, is go after the choke points. How do you address that in this kind of a case? How do you balance the commercial desire to shrink the space with the fragility? And given that fragility is kind of an abstract or ephemeral concept, when opposed to the cost of running 100 different tools, how do you balance that?
Well, I wish you'd ask Chris that first because it's a really hard question. But I think and there are trade-offs and so on, and it is about it's about making security sell. So, I mean, you could, I mean, there are all sorts of problems with the massive consolidation of cloud provision. But actually, from what we can tell so far, security is not is not particularly one of them, because somehow we seem to have incentivized the two titans of cloud computing to take cloud security extremely seriously, and the comparative budget of what I had at GCHQ, the National Cybersecurity Center, relative to Microsoft and Amazon Web Services, it peels into insignificance. So I think it is, I mean, under the broad and easy, so therefore lazy umbrella of how do you make security sell, there are a bunch of hard choices. How far are we going to regulate it? Part of it is going to be how do you even identify choke points? I mean, intelligence services are sort of paid to identify choke points. But how do you figure out? I mean, again, reflecting honestly on my own time in government, did I know? I knew some of them, but did I know all of them? The strategically important suppliers of software or hardware services to government and their standards of security. Yeah, I mean, I hope I left that. I hope I left that sort of set of risks better than I found it, but I certainly wouldn't say it was in a completely satisfactory position. So, again, there's that sort of hard thinking. What are the information flows you need? What then are the standards? If it's government, what are the contractual provisions you want to put into it? Should, even in government, given its purchasing power in this sort of area, be required to have regard to the sort of trade-off of diversity versus fertility that you talked about? Should there be somebody tasked with taking a whole of government view if it's government, and then what do you do in privately owned critical infrastructure? So those are some of the ways thinking about it. I mean, none of them would magically solve the entire problem, but it might nudge us more in the direction of getting security to sell, which is what all this is going to be about.
Okay, Chris, do you have thoughts on that?
I'll kind of invoke the Ciaran principle, which is it's hard to follow Ciaran. So I would say that I think of it this way, that if you imagine a continuum from a very simple architecture, kind of single layers, single devices, kind of it's easy to manage, not necessarily from a security perspective, but just easy to figure out, what your defenses are because they're few and simple, to an enormously complex environment on the other end of that. Generally, if you're an adversary, you would prefer the complex environment because there are a lot more shadows, there are a lot more seams, there are a lot more places to insinuate yourself. You can hide in the noise because in complex environments, the people who build them don't typically build them in a layered complementary fashion. You're essentially adding a patchwork quilt of things that make it such that there are lots of seams inside of that. That then says, from a defender's perspective, you probably not want an overly complicated environment that you yourself can't understand, that's not built in a way that is layered and complementary. You tend to kind of drive yourself back towards, do I have a simple architecture that I can defend? That being said, you can only imagine that being a rational answer, a simple architecture, if you add in the fact that it's not single point of failure architecture, but rather a simple architecture. You have belts and suspenders and Velcro, and you add the component of people, ever vigilant, ever present people that aren't watching this technology succeed or fail on its own. It doesn't defend itself, but standing in to defend that simple, clear architecture that essentially has a clear field of view and ability to understand what an anomaly looks like off the baseline, where people can then prevail on that field of battle. So from my view, I prefer simple architectures that are built in a complementary fashion and then add in that leavening ingredient of people who are ever present, ever vigilant, and hard to beat when they stand on a piece of territory that they understand.
So Chris, I want to ask a little bit of a inside question. I know the answer to this from the Naval Academy, but can you talk about the difference between securing a network and defending a network?
Well, first, I don't think it is possible to secure a network. I think it's possible to make a network defensible, meaning you imbue it with properties, qualities, and the hardware, the software, the hardware, or the firmware, and the people who are often on the front lines of those networks, such that you have a reasonable prospect of kind of defending it, which then leads to you have to actually defend it. You have to actually engage, right, an adversary, whether that's nature, whether that's an animal, whether that's simply something you forgot, or an active adversary who's coming at you. You have to engage them because the system is not a static thing. It's a living organism, and it's typically an undulating landscape. So make it defensible, then actually defend it, and you have a reasonable prospect of taking on something or someone that's coming at you. Now, I often use this analogy at the Naval Academy, which is very dangerous for me since I'm an Air Force Academy graduate. But that being said, what I love is this analogy of the submarine. No submarine leaves port in a perfect condition. As a matter of fact, my son, who's a submariner, once told me there are two things about subs you need to know. A, it's always trying to kill its crew. Now, I don't think that's literally true. That's a bit of a kind of a cartoon, but there's a nuclear reactor on board. It's a dangerous environment, a lot of curved, dark spaces, whirring machines in the night. You know the drill. But two, having said that, they strap it on, they sally forth, and they go into this complicated environment, the undersea world, and they outwit, they outmaneuver their adversaries. That's a great metaphor for cyberspace. It's never perfect, and sometimes it's trying to kill us. But if you understand it, if you strap it on and you sally forth and add the human component, which is to actually defend that platform, understanding all of its deficiencies and its strengths, and you use the principles of maneuver, right, and agility, and audacity, right, you might just outwit, outmaneuver your adversary in that commonplace, the undersea world or cyberspace. I think that's a decent analogy for cyberspace. Never going to be perfect, never going to be secure, at best defensible, and if we defend it, we might just prevail.
Okay, Ciaran, given what Chris just said, can you extrapolate from that to how the principle that Brandon talked about in the last section of zero trust networking might work in terms of securing cyberspace? You know, in terms of zero trust is something that's been pushed by NIST, and it's been talked about by NSA and been talked about by lots of people. And it's basically the idea of you know, not trusting any device or any service, but authenticating it each time. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the zero trust as a concept is one of those moments where, for a generalist, actually, it's quite helpful. And it's quite helpful just to sit back and reflect on what the two words mean and try to demystify them and put them in a non-technical environment. And I think, you know, the subject of this panel is SolarWinds. It's a very, very good example. You know, we have been, over the last decade and so forth, I think we've become less, gradually and not completely, less tolerant of people of, and I'm not picking on anybody or any one incident or anything in particular, but we've become gradually less tolerant of people in effect contracting out risk. And when things go wrong, saying we have, well, you know, but we had this in place or we had this supplier. And in a sense, you know, again, one of the interesting consequences of talking about supply chain risk is it does get you into that ownership thing. I mean, you know, to what extent, if you're, you know, if you're done through a supplier, to what extent is that your responsibility? To what extent is that your suppliers? And I think it's a very, very interesting set of questions that brings to the heart of zero trust, and it's quite a helpful way of thinking about it. It really, really is. So, you know, I remember the first time I came across this in government was in the defence supply chain. Not the sort of really serious, you know, absolutely critically important national security capabilities, but, you know, routine defense equipment. Supply chains are so complicated that nobody can really, you know, a diktat saying, you know, you must be able to trace everything to source and so forth is just impossible and so forth. But so it forced people to think, in effect, before the phrase was coined, or at least in widespread use, it made people think about zero trust. It made people think about, well, this is my system. You know, the fact that it may be composed of 26 different parts from A to Z doesn't really matter. It's my system. I need to understand how it works, and broadly where the sort of critical dependencies are, where the off buttons are, or the dim buttons, and so forth. And that's where I think zero trust comes in. I think if you look at the telecom security bill in the UK Parliament at the minute, and you look at the stuff that the National Cybersecurity Centre has put around on it, there's something there which says this piece of legislation is predicated that every piece of equipment in a telecoms network can fail, either accidentally or deliberately. And when you just read it like that and you think, well, that's a perfectly logical and appropriate basis on which to build a national telecoms network. It's also basically zero trust. So that's why I think it is a concept whose time has come.
Okay. Chris, when we had Kevin Mandia and General David Petraeus on earlier, one of the things that I believe it was General Petraeus talked about was the need for an NSA-like entity inside the United States, and he specifically said not NSA because of the civil liberties aspect, and advocated for giving CISA those sorts of capabilities as a possible outcome. What do you think of the idea in general of how do you counter adversaries like the Russians in SolarWinds and the Chinese in the Microsoft Exchange, who operate from the U.S. to the U.S. with apparently the intent, desire to avoid foreign intelligence capabilities?
Yeah, so first I agree with the premise. The implementation of it's probably going to be different than any other domain of interest that we've applied that to in the past. Why? Because cyber is by its very nature diffused in terms of where authority, competence, and often willpower to act lives. They're really hard to align those three. That is a classic problem within our federal enterprise, the U.S. federal enterprise. Typically, the competence, the deep and sharp competence that's derived from tens of years of experience in the telecommunications domains lives in place A. We'll leave that to your imagination as to where those places might be. And yet the authority, for all manner of good reasons, not least of which is kind of political sensibility and the sense of who should be working domestic, lives in a different place. We're not going to align those two, get those into the same place by kind of subordinating one of those to the other. Typically, classically in cyber, what we're going to have to do is to figure out how do we integrate and collaborate by using that diversity of competence and authority. How do we collaborate by using that? And we're really in a good place with respect to the prospect for doing that, because increasingly we realize we're not defending separate patches of the same thing. We're simply defending the same thing in different patches, right? So the supply chain example comes to mind, right? If all I defend is the kind of the 2 linear feet of wire, cable, kind of conduit under my feet, and you do that to the left of me or to the right of me, that's an insane proposition. We don't fight as coalitions, kinetic wars that way. We try to figure out how to combine our assets and fight on a common battlefield using all of those assets in combination. So it may well be that that organization that General Petraeus talks about is in the physical reality one where the authority is vested in the Department of Homeland Security, and the capability is vested not simply in Department of Homeland Security by the people who show up on that floor, the leading elements of NSA, of CIA, of FBI, of the private sector, because most of the tools that are useful in this space are actually in the private sector. And so the hardest, perhaps most mind-bending collaboration of all is how do we figure out how to break down the barriers between the private and the public sector? Because 240 years of our experience or more have told us that the private sector operates in place A, spiritually and physically, and that the public sector acts in place B, publicly and spiritually, and yet cyberspace does not respect that. And so my view is that we can figure out how to do that if we lose the idea that it's got to be one organization in one place with one authority. That's never going to work.
Okay. Ciaran, you ran the NCSC. If I recall the words correctly, on the wall in little bitty letters underneath NCSC, it said a division of GCHQ. But basically, you did public-private partnership in order to defend the UK. Can you talk about that and how that worked?
Sure, and just to pick up on, I'm very sympathetic to what Chris just said, and I think when you compare and contrast different governing systems, I mean, firstly, the US is so much bigger than everything else and has so many sort of world-class capabilities, which I was lucky enough to have at my disposal, and the NCSC whilst it did outreach well, I hope, needed to have hard technical and operational substance behind it. And so much of that was done through the Five Eyes partnership, particularly through the NSA, for which I will be eternally grateful. The other comparative point is that the UK government is very easy to reorganize legally. The US government, as you know, is not. So, you know, there are trade-offs in every system, and that's just a function of different constitutions, but I think it gets underplayed in this debate. But in terms of doing public-private partnerships, I think firstly, we did 2 or 3 things. One was an inversion of posture around secrecy. You know, David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister when the decision was taken to set us up, you know, sort of playfully, but there was sort of a punch behind it. Once accused us of being the best students of cybersecurity. You know, we would brief him on very classified details, which we were very proud of the excellent technical and operational work required to get that information. But he, and it was a really, really good political challenge, said, well, you know, what are you going to do with this? And if the answer was, well, it's far too secret, Prime Minister, then it was, well, thank you very much for giving me something to worry about that I can do nothing about. And I think, you know, actually, you know, when you put it like that, that's a really good way of thinking about it. So there was an inversion of the presumption of secrecy, which I think is reasonably well suited to cybersecurity. It does have its secrets, but there are ways of getting useful information out there. There was an interesting point, and I've had interesting conversations with US colleagues about this, about legal risk, where, I mean, in my view, and I'm speaking only about the UK here, I'm not making any inferences about the US, in an open market centered right country that, you know, that doesn't instinctively reach for government interference, this was not an area where business were telling government to get out of the way. So when the government said, I mean, there were 2 big sort of calls that we made. One was certainly in the first years, and I think as the NCC matures, they'll have to get their head around this. But as in the starting days, when people said, well, what's the balance of risk between government and private sector? My answer in the early days was, I don't care. You know, the cumulative output of the activity of both is not commensurate to the risk and the task at hand. So if the government wants to do a bit more than it might normally do in interference in critical national infrastructure, no one's going to complain, and they didn't. So that was one judgment. The other was that, you know, if you struck up a decent relationship with one company, its competitors didn't complain, and there was, you know, so I think there was an important sort of legal thing. In essence, I mean, we invited them in. We said, look, we're here to co-build things with you. We did have a physical infrastructure in London, which pre-pandemic allowed us to, you know, get CISOs, CTOs in to talk about common problems. I mean, literally put post-its on walls and, you know, whiteboards and that sort of thing, you know, co-design regulatory schemes and so forth. We had a good practical system, which was actually the idea of a politician and a business person, not mine, to have a scheme called Industry 100, where up to 100 paid secondees, not all full-time, from the private sector came in to learn in government. And, you know, it meant that if we were writing advice about cybersecurity in the energy sector, it kind of helped to have somebody who was 2 days a week who worked in the energy sector and cybersecurity and understood that this piece of guidance was completely inappropriate to the realities of working in that sector, which someone like me might not have known. So there were sort of innovations like that. And finally, we did have some luck, but I hope it was at least earned luck. So if you take declassification of information, we declassified a lot more information than we ever did. I mean, long-time analysts, and as you know, the turnover in this sort of area can be quite low. Long-term analysts, I remember one saying when we declassified some indicators of compromise from APT 28 in Russia, said, you know, 10 years ago, this genuinely would have been classified secret. Now it's on our website. We never declassified anything harmful by mistake, where that was an obvious risk. Having said all that, I think why I say we earned our luck was that I did have the explicit conversation with politicians to say, if you want this, you know, Mr. Cameron, etc., and successors, if you want this sort of service, then something's going to go wrong, and that's when we need your support. So we're explicitly asking you to make a risk judgment here, and the assumption that something will go wrong at some point. So those are just some of the things, but yeah, so it was, you know, openness, a bit of greater appetite for legal risk, and giving them something operationally useful and channels to communicate.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, can I add three things to that I think we have learned from the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK, which, as I've observed the operation of that facility, these things are seemingly self-evident to them, but they are profoundly and sharply contrasted with the US experience in ways that we should learn, we should embrace. The first is when Ciaran talks about the inversion of secrecy. Let me extend that a bit. What I observed the NCSC doing, which was simply brilliant, was kind of inverting the collaboration model, which is in the United States, we have a tendency to try to determine when and where we should collaborate based upon our own sense of what might be valuable to a counterpart. So inside of our stovepipe, we kind of enrich information. We get to a place where some synapse, some kind of observation fires, and we say, this is valuable to somebody else, and I now want to share it. Unfortunately, at that point, it's either highly proprietary or it's classified, and we have this sanitization process, which is just insane in terms of the amount of time and the complication that it takes. But what the Brits have done is to simply say, we're going to share at the lowest possible level before we enrich this information, such that you might want to then further enrich it in your stovepipe or I in mine. But we being connected at that foundational level, we're probably going to be predisposed to enrich it together. And as the crisis rises, we essentially have a relationship that gets all the stronger as we move into that crisis. Two, our UK friends have a proclivity to act. They don't admire the problem until it gets big enough or gets, to be the most important or the high priority. Say, look, we're going to essentially operate against those opportunities in hand. Sometimes if a small thing is shown to work, you build it and you make it a moderate or a big thing. In the United States, we sometimes have a tendency to want to build the mother of all things, this huge, complicated beast, which is never perfect on its first kind of instance when you turn the kind of go key, smoke issues forth. And so that's not a helpful way. Just do something, get moving, and you'll figure it out as you go. And the third, which is that I think their model for collaboration is that it's the byproduct of professional intimacy. It's not the byproduct of information sharing alone. It's not the byproduct of some kind of process or authority. They literally get together, and those relationships where they know each other in a professionally intimate way, understand what each other's challenges, insights, perspectives might be in ways they could never explain through a series of messages, telegrams, kind of rich prose. That then begets the kind of relationships that then extend out of the NCSC into the organizations behind them. Those three are enormously powerful insights. In the Solarium Commission, we've tried to take advantage of all three. We're trying to legislate and executive order our way into that, but at some point we need to just do them.
So Chris, that actually leads into my next question, which is, can you talk about what the Solarium Commission is doing that, or is recommending that might leverage what you saw in the UK's NCSC and potentially help with a SolarWinds type event?
Well, I'd say those things that I just mentioned, and extending from that, the Solarium Commission determined, not alone, most of what you find in that report has been written about before, but at this point, we're trying to actually get some traction on it. How do you actually begin to do these things? Solarium Commission has recommended that we have to fix three things if we're to have a national strategy of some consequence within the United States. One, we have to sort out roles, responsibilities. We have to reshape, right, the expectations of who does what and what are norms, what are expected behaviors that make sense. So get that right. Second, we need to make the system itself resilient and robust such that it might then be defended. That's a combined activity, but get it such that this is defensible and defended, and not just the technology, but the people, the doctrine. Part one pertains here. And then third, align actions and consequences. Those are both good actions, which should be inspired or perhaps have some benefits accrued to them. Perhaps the reduction of liability if you act well in this space, or an expectation you'll get support if you act well in this space, and align kind of bad actors, kind of actions to consequences, impose consequences. And in that regard, the context is really important. The context must be that we're not simply talking about cyber consequences, but all instruments of power. We've talked a lot in the United States about persistent engagement and defending forward using cyber assets, what Cyber Command does. I'm a proponent of that. but we should act similarly with respect to our legal remedies, our diplomatic remedies, our financial remedies. All of those things should discern at the earliest possible moment that there's a problem. All of those should act at the highest with the highest possible leverage, meaning at the earliest possible moment, and they should act in combination. That's the second important attribute. How do we make it such that if you're an adversary in this space, you have to beat all of us to beat one of us? That's the jump the shark moment, where we move from defending individual patches using episodically applied instruments of power with a bias towards technology and a bias to reacting well as opposed to anticipating well. How do we get to a place where we've used all of those in combination, and you've got to beat all of us to beat one of us? If we get there, SolarWinds it's not a cakewalk, but it's a lot easier.
Okay. Ciaran, can you talk about how SolarWinds, had that happened in the UK, how the NCSC might have been involved in that or engaged in that?
That's something that I've thought about, thankfully, less than I might have had it happened a year ago. But and I do think that it shows, again, structural changes and changes in emphasis of activity are not the same thing. And so if we can make an observation on the US, not just in SolarWinds, but in terms of protecting the election and so forth, I think that the US system in terms of outreach to small parts of local government for elections, or in SolarWinds to businesses and so on, is very different and much better than it was on the same sort of path as the UK. I think there would have been a lot in common with the way the US handled it. I mean, there is the sense of confusion and shock. I mean, let's not underestimate the human factors here as the scale of this and the sophistication and cleverness of it comes. I mean, one of the things I always remember about exercising was we never exercised the right thing. The next major incident in cybersecurity was, I remember we did our first one in 2016, which was about some critical national infrastructure disruption. It ended up being WannaCry, an accidental worm disrupting hospital bookings. The last thing, I don't know what they're exercising now, but I bet you it wasn't a really old-fashioned, in some respects, supply chain compromise of great strategic importance, of the utmost stealth and so forth. So I think there would have been that moment of wow, just trying to come to terms with this, looking for the, if you like, weaponization of the accesses, and seeing if either that had happened, we hadn't noticed yet, or whether it was likely to happen. What I would hope might have happened then was, I mean, if you take, CloudHopper was not similar. It was much noisier. It was much more widespread and so forth. But I do remember, and again, one of the advantages was of the NCSC model, and perhaps the smaller size of the country. And whilst there are lots of disadvantages to the grotesque centralization of the United Kingdom and London, there are advantages in that you can convene people really easily. I remember after CloudHopper, the then Deputy Prime Minister convened the chief executives of some of the 100 biggest companies in the country to go through all of this and say that these are what's happening. So I think it probably would have been that sort of the rapid sort of awareness raising about how to get to the nub of the problem would have been there. I think we would have struggled in the same way as, it's a very complex, listen, I won't repeat Chris's very thoughtful exposition of the sort of challenges of response in these different cases and the mixture of cyber and non-cyber means. I think there would have been the same dilemmas, and probably would have been slower, if I'm honest, than whatever's happened in Washington. And what I would really, really hope, I think, is that because I know of other cases that did do this, prompt a bit of soul searching about the sort of cybersecurity ecosystem, the sort of things I was talking about earlier, about responsibilities, about incentives, about regulation and so forth. Because, for example, there is a piece of legislation about to go through the UK Parliament, and it's been delayed by the pandemic, but in a sense takes us back to the Mirai botnet of 2016. It's about IoT security and about trying to make it less easy to take UK infrastructure and use it as a weapon of destruction through DDoS attacks. So the same principle in SolarWinds. I would hope that it will have prompted, and had it happened in the UK, have prompted an even more accelerated version of a serious policy consideration. What does this mean for supply chain security and so on? So that's those are the sort of similarities and differences of how it might have played out in the UK.
Thanks. Yeah, Chris.
Just add, it comes to mind that in your last two questions, one of the challenges we have, particularly in the US, is how to classify, how to characterize SolarWinds. Is it an attack? I don't think so. Is it simply a highly surgical surveillance operation with a national security purpose, and therefore we have to at some point tacitly accept it? I don't think so. I think that our inability to say what it is between those two endpoints is part of the problem. I would say that it is likely that we have to think more broadly than simply about the mechanism. We have to think about the mechanism, we have to think about the purpose, we have to think about the scale. So the mechanism, it weakens some aspect of security necessary to perhaps pick the lock. The purpose, it might well be that it was for surveillance purposes. There might be a national security purpose behind that. But the scale is the thing, in my view, that it's egregious. Right? Imagine someone goes to your local hardware store and they render all of the physical locks that are on that aisle inoperable, such that you can't tell, but they simply don't work as they should. And anyone who knows the secret kind of can get into your house. And the criminal who does that then kind of says in court when they're caught, but I only went into one of those 10,000 houses. Trust me, I only went into one. Right? They're still going to be held liable for the 10,000, right? The scale as opposed to the one. And so we need to think our way through what is it that's egregious about that? And it's going to be a complicated kind of framing, but if we get to that place and we establish that, maybe not by way of absolute precedent, but we put that on the table, we'll begin to have a framework within which we can say these activities should be judged more harshly than these activities, at least rank order them, if not put them on some absolute scale.
I think that's right, Chris. I also think that you need to look, a fourth component I would add to your dimensions of SolarWinds is the what did that enable them to do that they didn't? Like, in other words, I've got access now. I could put down a destructive payload very easily. And the only reason they didn't was because someone in Moscow decided they weren't going to. And that's not an okay place for the nation to be in my view.
Yeah, I agree. I might have put that on purpose, but I did not describe it that way. I think that's an excellent fourth element.
Okay, I'm going to ask Suzanne Kelly to come back, and Suzanne's got some questions.
I love, honestly, Rick, just picking up where you left off, which is the question of how bad could this have been. Ciaran talked about how do you articulate harm earlier in the conversation, and then Chris came in with a great analogy of the submarine. You feel like you're kind of attached to something that's always trying to kill you. I mean, I wonder if it's going to take one of these events that is trying to, and we've seen this in Israel and we saw this in Florida, where there's a cyber component that could actually lead to death or harm. Is it going to take one of these events to get all of these people on board, all of these people who have been kind of floating around these great ideas for years, who have clearly identified we need better intelligence sharing, but to actually prompt us to act? And I ask that against the backdrop of a year of COVID, in which, it was the worst thing that in our lifetimes that has hit the globe, yet there was so much sort of difference of approach to how we developed vaccines, to how we shared information, to how we're looking at distribution. Is there some comparison there, I just wonder? And I'd like all three of you to answer to where we are with cyber right now. So two parts. Is it going to take a life-ending event to get us to think about this differently? And the second, how is the community, the global community, going to come together using lessons learned from COVID possibly to address it? Rick, why don't you start, since you've been the one asking all the questions this hour?
So I'm a pessimist, and I think yeah, it is going to take something like that to get people to take it seriously. I think it's going to take something where people die, to get people to really do the things to make fundamental organizational, cultural, big resource shifts that you need to take.
Yeah. And then do you think it's possible, just as a second part of that, Rick, in the way that we've addressed COVID, do you think it's possible that we can sort of speed up the process or not?
Well, if you disregard the fact that you need people to die first, then yeah, I think you could draw some lessons from the COVID. experience.
Yeah. Chris, what do you think?
I think that we already know enough to know that we've already experienced a polar harbor. It's been sufficiently diffused that because it didn't happen on the same screen for all of us, or it didn't happen at the same time to all of us, we can imagine that, you know, it's simply something taking shots in the dark and we're innocent. We're going to be held harmless from that. So it is a problem. I think to some extent, if we then wait for a voluntary kind of a willingness on the part of some consensus body within our society to say, we're ready, we've just crossed the line, we'll wait forever. It will never happen. And therefore, I think that the government is going to have to step in at some point and say, you know, we have crossed that line, it's time. In the same way that they've done for, say, traffic safety, when we would as a society stand idly by and watch tens of thousands of people killed in traffic accidents because of the way we designed or did not properly designed roadways and automobiles, and because of kind of a tolerance of driving while drunk. The government stepped in and said, this is a problem. It's a societal problem. It's one where the government needs to at least declare the problem and then perhaps avail itself of both government policy and private sector resources to fix. We've done that for air traffic safety. The NTSB and the FAA combined are hugely beneficial to the flying public. I would not want to be a member of the flying public without those. We need to step forward and do something similar in cyberspace. And not just with respect to the wet blanket, bringing that to the party, but with that very positive and bullish statement about what the positive aspects of this are. And I'd go one further, which is cyber has now encroached in its third iteration into an attack on our confidence. I think one of the most pernicious things about SolarWinds is the attack on the confidence we have that digital infrastructure will serve our purpose. One of the most pernicious aspects of the Russian activities in 2016 and 20 is the lack of confidence that might induce in our society's reliance on democracy. And so how do we become bullish about reaffirming what those kind of core values are, civics perhaps 102, such that people say there's a reason why we have digital infrastructure, there are purposes for which we apply this, there's a reason why we have this democracy, and you're going to have to beat our concept of why that is, the sense of our intellectual resilience, as much or more as the technology underneath that. Government actually has the role of standing into both of those problems.
That's an excellent description. Ciaran, what are we missing?
Well, I don't think we're missing much you would expect from Rick and Chris. I would strike a slightly more optimistic tone than Rick, perhaps, in that, I mean, firstly, in terms of, I mean, there's a variety of actors out there, states and criminals and so on, exploiting the insecurities. And I think one of the things that we have to do is make sure that we level with the public about risk and harm. So, for example, during SolarWinds, I got a little bit cross with the BBC when it was revealed that, I can't remember the exact name of the agency, but one of the American nuclear weapons authorities had been one of the victims. But the way the BBC ran it was that, you know, I mean, put it this way, it did not say that it did not say that this did not mean that the Russians had unfettered control of America's nuclear arsenal, which of course it did not and never did, and so forth. So I think, you know, there is something here about making sure, it's going back to the discussion of harm, that we are clear about, you know, subtleties, nuance, and gradations of harm. I'm not saying it was a good thing by any stretch of the imagination that the Russians were in that organization, but it's not the same thing as having control of the hardware. By way of counterpoint, I think that the most likely way in which a death is going to occur, if it happens, I hope it doesn't this year, is through sort of criminal ransomware in a hospital. I mean, there was almost an official classification of a death in Germany last year, although the authorities couldn't prove what they called negligent homicide in Germany. And to me, it seems more likely that you know, the reckless exploitation of insecurity by criminals for money, which will disrupt systems like hospital admissions systems, is more likely to cause harm than, say, for example, I remember this is a real sort of thing that I researched and exercised, you know, an attack on a railway signaling system, where if a railway signaling system is compromised, in most competently designed railway systems, instead of crashing into each other and causing mass fatalities, the trains stop, causing mass inconvenience, which is a different problem. So, you know, we do have to think about these things and think about why, despite all the sort of catastrophic warnings of the last 20 years, to quote Professor Thomas Ridge, cyber war has not sort of taken place in that respect. So I think we need to be nuanced and realistic think about the harms and the dangers, but there probably will be a wake-up call at some point. And then where I would want to build on that is Chris's automobiles, aviation safety and so forth. I mean, that is the sort of logic we should be applying to the digital environment. That will help with everything. It will help with ransomware. It will help with SolarWinds type nation state intrusions. The challenge for us, being honest about things like SolarWinds, and plenty of others have said this, is that, you know, I do accept and agree with Chris's point about scale. People will, of course, ask hard questions in return about the about organisations that we all proudly served in, and and so on, and did so under very careful laws and so forth. But I think that when if we are looking at ultimately at, I think there are two different things you can look at. One is a generic, sustained effort across like-minded countries to improve digital security. The other is your sort of, more negotiated set of acceptances on international norms. The first we should just get on and do anyway. It's, it's technocratic, it's economic, it's regulatory, and we should sort of do it. The second has more challenging implications for the way we think about our role in the digital world.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Suzanne, if I can just close by saying one thing. The reason we have all the traffic safety issues, rules and bodies that we have now is because we killed a lot of people in the early days before we had those things. And my fear is that we're going to kill a lot of people with cyber before we take it seriously.
Yeah, and the frustrating part is knowing it's a possibility and not following up on Chris's advice and the advice of the commission to act. Sometimes it's time to stop thinking quite so much and start acting. I really, that resonates. Thank you so much. Well, thank you both, Chris Inglis, Ciaran Martin, Rick, for leading that expert discussion. I think it's incredibly helpful. I have a list of greatest hits out of this conversation that we're going to be sharing on the Cipher Brief, including kind of Chris's fantastic way of describing the mind-bending challenge of that public-private cooperation on these issues. So I love what you mentioned, Chris, about losing the idea of one organization in one place with one authority. So we're going to kind of take the best of this conversation today, which was fantastic, and move it through the conversations over the next 2 days. So I just want to thank you both for being here and for contributing to this very important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Suzanne, Rick, for providing the venue.
Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely. So Rick, wow, 3 hours went by, and like it does feel like the blink of an eye. These are such important conversations that we're trying to really kind of push forward with some of the smartest minds in industry about these things. What are your kind of key takeaways from today as we head into tomorrow?
I need time to assimilate. Ask me at opening tomorrow what my key takeaways were from today. I'm an introvert. I have to process.
I know, I'm actually like that too. I've been taking a lot of notes, so I have a little cheat sheet here, but it is kind of overwhelming if you think of everything that was brought up today and just the fantastic points by the list of speakers. All right, well, let's remind you of who's coming up tomorrow. We are really looking forward to talking with Microsoft President Brad Smith to continue some of the conversations from today. He's going to be joining us in conversation with Sue Gordon as well. And then we want to urge those of you who aren't getting that morning daily brief newsletter to go ahead and sign up for that. It's free. It's at thecipherbrief.com, where we will be highlighting a lot of kind of what's said, and then you're also getting kind of the overview, not only of a great open source morning read, but also you're getting the highlights from Cipher Brief experts. It's really expert-driven perspective that we publish on that website. Also, we have a threat conference that Rick's been a part of in Sea Island every year. It is similar to this, but hopefully in person. That is in late October. There's information about that at tcbconference.com. And then I want to just take one more second to really thank our sponsors for helping us host these events. It's not easy to pull this off. We do it because so many of the participants and speakers are equally dedicated to being a part of solving these issues. None of them get paid to do this, obviously, so the sponsorship really helps. And Kelly Bissell and his leadership at Accenture Security, we very much appreciate that. And Babs Doherty, thank you, from Preferred System Solutions. With that, we're going to let everybody go. Everyone finally gets a bathroom break. No, I'm just kidding. Hopefully you've had a break already in the last 3 hours. And Rick, we'll see you back here tomorrow.
All right, Suzanne, thanks. Looking forward to it.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.